Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Real Estate Live UK. We're here this afternoon coming back to you with another great session. We've had a busy day so far. We've been everywhere. We've been started off in London. We then went to the Upper Lee Valley and then we moved over to Kingston where we were talking about logistics and the industrial sector. But I'm delighted that this afternoon for the last session for today, we're here talking about urban innovation and the road towards net zero in partnership with London and Partners and the NLA. Now, before we get underway this afternoon, just to really give you some housekeeping notes, I'm sure you're all very au fait now with Zoom, but we'd love for you to talk to us this afternoon, and you can do that by using the Q&A button that's on your taskbar, or you can chat to us using the chat function. And throughout this session, we will be able to talk to you and put your questions to the panel. We're also running a poll as part of Real Estate Live UK. We're going to launch that now. It's asking you what you think the most important factors are in terms of unlocking the development and ensuring the continued strength of the UK real estate sector. Now, you do have a multiple choice opportunity, and we're asking you now just to take a few seconds to choose what you think the most important factors are, and then we'll be able to share those results both from this session, but also cumulatively across the whole week to be able to really understand where people are coming from in these current unprecedented times. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over now to Lisette from London and Partners, who's going to lead this session. Hi, Lisette.
Thank you, Catherine, and good afternoon, everyone. As Catherine already mentioned, welcome to today's panel discussion on urban innovation and the road towards net zero in the built environment. Hopefully that clue already might have prompted you to choose a very particular answer to the poll. I know that we are not allowed to vote as panelists, but thankfully I managed to have my say earlier in the week when I was in the audience. As I mentioned, my name is Lisette de Metz. I'm the Head of Urban Innovation for London and Partners. For those of you who don't know us, London and Partners is the international trade, investment and promotion agency for London. And it's my pleasure to be your chair for today's panel, which, as Catherine already mentioned, we are delivering in partnership with New London Architecture. And this panel is really an opportunity to talk about a very important topic, which is the transition towards net zero. As most of you will know, the UK, as one of the main countries, has committed to a net zero greenhouse gas emission targets by 2050 through the amendments to the Climate Change Act. London similarly has committed to a net zero target by 2050, as reflected in the London Environmental Strategy. But sometimes we forget that buildings play a key part in this. Very often we'll be talking about transport and the emissions from that. But today we're going to particularly focus on the built environment. And there's, of course, an obvious reason for that, which is that we are responsible for a significant part of emissions. So just to give that a little bit of context, according to the EU energy centres, buildings use about 40% of global energy, 25% of global water, 40% of global resources, and they emit about a third of greenhouse gas emissions. So those are some significant numbers, and therefore there's a real need for change in the built environment. And the UK really isn't dissimilar in this. There's about 22% of our carbon emissions are directly attributable to new construction and existing buildings, going up to over 40% if we take into account all of the infrastructure. So it really is critical that we all play our part in this transition to net zero. And there is a lot of great work being done, new policies, pledges, strategies, initiatives, many of which we will be talking about today. But we'll also be talking about the barriers to implementing solutions at the scale and the pace that are needed to get us there by 2050, if not before. So we have a great lineup of speakers who I'll introduce to you shortly. As I mentioned, we'll be talking specifically about London's transition. So we'll be focusing on challenges, barriers, how we can leverage policy and regulatory tools, the importance of capital, new business models, and also the role of public and private sector. Just as a reminder, you do have the opportunity to ask questions to our speakers. So as Catherine mentioned, please do submit them as we go along, and we'll try to answer as many as we can throughout the session. So I'll start by briefly introducing our 4 panelists for today. So firstly, we're joined by Benjamin O'Connor. Benjamin's the Director of New London Architecture, London's leading centre for built environment, and our partner for today's panel. Ben is in charge of New London Programme of Events and Exhibitions. He previously was Director at the City Centre, where he developed several new streams of activity. And prior to that was Head of Operations at the Garden Museum, where he really developed his interests and expertise in green infrastructure and public space. We're also joined by Kate Hand. Kate is the Head of Climate Change for London Councils. She's previously worked as the Programme Manager for the London Environment Directors Network, to some of you known as LEDNet. And before joining local government, she has spent a decade working in environmental policy across a number of different organisations, including the Community Development Foundation. We're also joined by Niels Ruijs. Niels leads sustainable design and innovation in planning and construction at the FTSE 100 real estate company Landsec, where he is shaping a £3 billion development pipeline, including London's first net zero carbon buildings. Niels is responsible for developing Landsec's net zero carbon strategy. He's also one of the net zero experts for NLA's panel, and he was recognized in 2019 as one of GreenBiz 30 under 30 leaders in sustainability globally. And last but not least, we're joined by Tom Buttrick. Tom's the team leader in Southwark's planning policy team, where he's the lead officer on climate change and digital planning. He's currently working on emerging climate change policy for the new Southwark Plan, the Old Kent Road Area Action Plan, and carbon offsetting. So I hope you'll agree, we've got some great expertise in this virtual room, so I'm not going to hold you back from that any longer. I'm going to kick us off with a couple of opening questions for our panelists to talk a little bit about what they are doing and what they are bringing and their views on this. And I will start off, Kate, if I may, with you. As we know, many of London's boroughs have declared a climate emergency. So it is really front and centre of mind in the government sector. What is the role that London Council is playing in working with the boroughs and with the Greater London Authority on tackling climate change? And could you also reflect a little bit around how that work ties in with London's green recovery?
Sure, thanks, Lisa, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to take part. Looking forward to a really interesting discussion. So London Councils, for those of you who don't know, is the Association of the London Boroughs. So we represent the 32 boroughs and the City of London, and we work across party. So as you rightly say, climate change has really hugely risen up the agenda. I started in this role in February this year, so it's a kind of index of our investment in that area. And the boroughs have, over the last year, really accelerated their work on climate change. So 29 of the boroughs, possibly soon to be 30, have declared climate emergencies. And about 3/4 of those have set a target for net zero emissions by 2030 for the council-owned emissions, and about nearly a half for the borough-wide emissions for net zero by 2030, which is just hugely ambitious. And of course, the Mayor has brought his target forward to 2030 as well, which is really great to see. So lots of urgency and engagement, as well as kind of increasing recognition of some of the practical challenges that we face in doing this. And also recognition, I think, from the off that we cannot do this alone. So this is absolutely critical. London local government has a huge role to play and a great leadership role, as well as competency for its own emissions. But in areas like planning, it has a really significant leadership role and community leadership role. So that's something we're really focused on. And in terms of our work in particular, so we help the boroughs to collaborate, we do evidence and research, and we advocate on their behalf. And in that respect, we are particularly looking at the planning white paper at the moment, which I'm sure we may come back to. The basis of our work is a joint statement on climate change that we agreed last year in December. So it sets out kind of 7 major priorities for things that the boroughs have recognised they need to collaborate on together and with other partners, otherwise it's a bit difficult to achieve it at the borough level. And the second of those is low carbon development. The first is retrofitting. So the emissions from the built environment are very high on our radar. So it's very something the boroughs are aware of. So we're scoping an action plan to deliver that low carbon development piece of work with experts like Tom, which is really exciting. And just to talk about the recovery a little bit, so of course that has been also very much front and centre, though I would say that I think my perception is that borough's ambition on climate has not diminished as a result, even if frontline staff have been obviously called to other priorities and may again be called to other priorities during the autumn. So that kind of takes place under the London Recovery Board, which Lisa, I know you're familiar with, so it's co-chaired by the Mayor of London and London councils, and London partners and lots of other stakeholders sit on that board to help shape the recovery. There are 8 main missions they've agreed to deliver the recovery, and one of those is called the Green New Deal. I know that the Green New Deal is a concept that's been out there for a very long time. So this in London is a practical programme for us to accelerate and deliver work that can create jobs in the green economy. And we have adopted a target to double the size of the green economy by 2030, which feels really ambitious, but timely. That is what we need. And a lot of those jobs and skills will come forward in the built environment sector, in energy efficiency, in low carbon heating, and certainly in an area where I expect that we will see a lot of innovation, though we also have some more mundane challenges to address. It's not we don't need innovation everywhere, we need delivery as well. So that's mainly what we're focusing on. I would say that we've drawn together also a 1.1 billion pound pipeline of work that is aligned with the Green New Deal, which just shows the extent to which the boroughs are already delivering on this agenda. A lot of that is retrofitting and low carbon development, which is very exciting, and we'll be looking at ways to secure funding for that going forward. So yeah, I think that's probably me for the introduction, so thanks.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, a great few introductory comments there to set the scene for the rest of the conversation, and probably a number of things we'll come back to as we go forward, in particular the Green New Deal and the missions. But in some ways, it's great to see that so many of the boroughs have declare that emergency, because that of course means that they are going to undertake actions. I mean, it's not the good that we're in emergency, but it's good, I think, that we all recognize, and 30 out of 33 of course is a significant commitment, and some amazing targets also set by 2030. And good to also see that 2, of course, of the missions in the joint statement are around built environment retrofitting and low carbon development, which is probably a good segue to come over to Tom. We've of course heard from Kate, but what does that really mean at the local level? I'm going to assume here that the Borough of Southwark is of course one of those 30 boroughs that has made that commitment. I think that's probably a given, seeing as you are here. But I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit around what does that really mean at the local authority level? What are some of the key strategies you're setting, the challenges you're seeing, initiatives you're looking to take forward in the near to mid-term future?
Thank you, Lisette. And yes, to confirm that we did declare a climate emergency in March 2019. And from that date, we've been working hard to really understand, firstly, what does a 2030 climate emergency look like, seeing that's only 9.5 years away, when previously we've been aligned, obviously, for the 2050 Climate Act target, which adds us an extra 20 years, doesn't it? So no pressure on us all, on all the offices in all the boroughs who've declared that emergency. First of all, I'll just comment on how Southwark has addressed it in the corporate sense, and then I'll move on to planning, which obviously is of key interest to the audience today. We are currently consulting on a corporate-wide climate change strategy for the climate emergency, and that will then feed into a roadmap. And that covers all of the council services, not just planning and regeneration, but across transport, across social care, etc. So each division is looking at how it works, the influence it has, the procurement it has, looking at how we can encourage, cajole, and reduce emissions across the board. Because it's not just about council work itself, it's about encouraging the residents and the businesses of Southwark to be part of that, because we've declared a 2030 target for the borough, not just the council. So one of part of that role is to really push and influence like I said, colleagues and residents and businesses. In terms of planning, just briefly, I work in the planning policy team, and we have a new local plan going to examination in January, which was predicated on a 2050 target. And so what we're doing is an early review of an unadopted policy, an unadopted plan to tackle and address how we can reach that 2030 target. And we've been primarily looking at operational carbon in the first instance, around the implementation gap, and around encouraging the deployment of new technology, and actually looking at how we can go beyond, for example, the 35% of on-site deliverables, because as we know, well, from our research and our evidence base, that actually we need to push on-site delivery further. And so we're looking at options to increase on-site carbon reductions. So, like I said, that's kind of at the local plan stage. In terms of for example, the Old Kent Road Opportunity Area, Councillor Situ, who's our cabinet member, has declared that the Old Kent Road Opportunity Area will be a net zero opportunity area. Some of you may know Colin Wilson, who formerly the GLA, he's leading on that. And we have ambitious targets to have the first net zero opportunity area that we can find. There may be others before us, but the one that we can find. And that obviously is all around not only the operational carbon within the buildings, within the new buildings themselves, but obviously how we're addressing transport, how we're looking to invest in public transport infrastructure with the BLE, if it is a bit delayed. And that's that commitment to a net zero opportunity area is politically an incredibly important statement, especially as we have had a new cabinet recently who's reaffirmed that commitment. I guess just one last thing I'll just sort of touch on here today, in this section, is we're really pushing hard now on our carbon offset fund and the new cost of carbon, building on the work that Letty have done recently with Haringey leading and a number of other London boroughs. And we're keen now to push forward a revised cost of carbon that really does deliver on reducing carbon emissions on site in the first instance. And we're looking forward to getting that out to public consultation this autumn.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for bringing that to life a little bit more to what that means at the borough level. And indeed, no pressure bringing that forward to 2030 and making it a borough-wide target. That's very ambitious, and I do commend the council's forward-looking and initiatives in that. Of course, kind of one of the things we will realise is that, you know, this is not something government can do alone, particularly if we're looking at citywide and borough-wide targets. It requires citizens to make change, it requires businesses to make changes. And that's probably a good segue to come over to Nils and to look a little bit more around the private sector. Nils, you obviously work for a pretty large-scale commercial developer and investor. How are you approaching this transition to net zero? And is it something that, in your opinion, industry is kind of changing of its own accord and moving towards that? Or is there more need for tighter regulations, push from occupants, or possibly other areas?
Thanks, Suzette. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. So you're right. We're a large property company. We're actually one of the largest in the country. So we develop, own, operate real estate with a focus on commercial office and retail destinations. So our approach to sustainability over the past couple of years has very much been to come with the aim to lead our industry on the matter. That's really because, in my opinion, and that of many others within the organizations, you know, climate change is really the defining issue of the decade we have ahead of us. And as you previously mentioned, the built environment has a clear role to play in it. I think it's become increasingly clear. Also, we're hearing that coming from, you know, a growing social pressure. I think the role that organizations like ourselves have to play in tackling this accountability is growing. So I'll start by looking at the commitment that we set ourselves and actually what sort of pressures they actually respond to in responding to your question about what the industry is facing, using ourselves as an example. So we set long-term stretching climate commitment of our own, really because we're convinced that it's essential to our long-term success as a business, to be honest. That is why we have science-based carbon targets in line with the 1.5 degree pathway of the Paris Agreement, including both our direct and indirect emission. That's why we're working towards net zero carbon as a business by 2030, in line with the UK Green Building Council framework and definitions. Then I'll take a couple of minutes to explain the multiple drivers effectively that we're responding to with this strategy. And the first one is the fact that really our large institutional investors demand it. We're seeing increased expectations put on us as a large listed organization to have a robust plan in place to tackle the climate transition. We are not talking about small players here. We're talking actors like the Climate Action 100 Plus funds, represent over 35 trillions in asset under management. And organizations like these are demanding of the companies that they invest in to take action to reduce their emission in line with Paris, and to do a greater job at disclosing climate risk. The second driver that we're responding to is that really our direct customers demand it. We're seeing a shift in momentum from companies around sustainability responding to drivers of their own. So the number of our own customers setting themselves stretching environmental commitments, like science-based carbon targets, like net zero carbon commitments, is growing rapidly. So our occupiers demand space that will allow them to reach these commitments. And so us delivering space that is net zero carbon is effectively a way to answer our customers' demand, our customers' needs. Because for an organization is like a knowledge work firm, real estate and employee travel will be the two largest source of carbon emissions. So that's the second key driver that we're responding to. Third, really, we touched on that, is crucially important. The public authorities and the communities that we operate in expect it. We've heard 29, hopefully 30 London boroughs, including the GLA, have set climate emergency declarations, and it's a way for us to keep operating successfully in these communities, and we want to avoid the risk of, not responding to this would be a huge risk. We've seen the lessons of the Heathrow expansion, for example, being ruled out on ground of it not aligning with the Paris Agreement. And just passing, I think a final driver is really also around us corporately, around talent attraction and retention. I think it's crucially important. It won't be the topic of today, but being able to attract the best talent is also something that we can do by having these stretching commitments. So to answer your question, indeed, we're seeing these clear shifts in the industry through all these drivers. I don't think incremental change is going to cut it, though. Companies like ourselves are responding loud and clear, but at the same time, we're hearing from the Committee on Climate Change that emissions from buildings and the built environment have barely dropped, and actually we're really lagging behind. So to address these laggards, I think, yes, greater regulations will be needed, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this. To conclude, I think for us, it's really about de-risking our future, reducing the risk to our business as we collectively transition to a net zero carbon economy. The assets that don't align with the climate transition are going to be stranded. We've learned from the big oil write-offs over the summer. Really, I think companies that fail to adjust to the climate transition are going to be left behind, and we don't want to be there.
Thank you very much, Niels, and it's great to hear that a company like Landsec has set that commitment and that early commitment. But also, I think it's interesting that you touch upon the fact, that investors demand it, increasingly occupiers are demanding it, and then there is, of course, the authorities moving down the direction, the regulatory push. But it is quite interesting that there is a change, but at the same time, as you said, incremental is not enough, and our emissions aren't dropping enough yet in the built environment. So lots more to talk about, but I want to kind of go over to Benjamin. I'm sort of coming to you last for a reason. Of course, NLA has a kind of audience across the broader spectrum of the built environment, public, private sector, non-profit, and others, but also because you've been, of course, as many people will know, leading on a net zero program and a piece of research that's hoping to be published fairly soon. And I was just wondering if you could share your reflections, having already heard from Kate, Tom, and Niels, but what else have you heard from your network, and what are some of the challenges or kind of issues that you see, and how is that evidenced? Kind of where does London stand at the moment? Sum it up there.
Thank you, Lisa, and it's been really fascinating listening to all of those presentations. So good afternoon, everyone. As Lucette said, my name is Benjamin. I'm a director at New London Architecture. At NLA, our sort of core mission is to bring people together to shape a better city. So we do that through events like this, but also through exhibitions and research across a range of about 20 different topics and themes. So working with our network of over 600 built environment members, that's everyone from the sort of large developers like the Landsecks to small design firms and individuals in a range of careers, we're able to get a really good read on the industry on a whole range of issues. And as you said, Lucette, the net zero program we've been running for a few years now has been a really key focus for us. So in the past few months, we convened a net zero expert panel, which Tom was on. We brought together experts from across London and the built environment, as well as a separate think tank to identify some of the barriers we're facing when it comes to implementing net zero initiatives and reaching carbon neutral targets. So I just want to sort of summarize some of the key barriers that we've identified across our network, and many of which we've touched upon. There's the low carbon literacy, the policy gap, performance gap, lack of funding and resource in local authorities, lack of skill set across the industry, so from developers to architects to buildings on site, particularly around this issue of retrofit, the lack of green finance, and the lack of regulation enforcement. I could go on, but they're the sort of the key ones. There's a couple that I want to focus on just in my introduction. And the first one of those is the lack of access to finance, which is obviously a really key issue. Currently, property value is not affected by energy efficiency, which make developers, owners, and clients less incentivized in addressing the problem. So this issue of incentivization is really critical. The Green Finance Institute is looking at a different approach and business models for both homeowners and renters, which is going to be really critical. And local authorities are often left without much choice, particularly in the most sort of deprived and poorer areas, without having, I hate to say it, the luxury to demand better sustainability credentials in new developments. So all really important factors under the financial challenges. Around policy and regulation, I think it's fair to say, from some of what we've heard today and what we've evidenced at our think tanks and expert panel, that these are not really fit for purpose anymore, and they're only setting out the minimum standard as opposed to the ambition that we should be striding for. There's also a real problem with the lack of data and common frameworks, which means that it's difficult to look at the comprehensive carbon emissions. So that doesn't just stop at the building, but it's looking more holistically across the whole piece from kind of inception through to delivery, which is really key. So those are just a couple of the themes that we took from our expert panel and think tank, which is going to inform this key piece of research that you mentioned on Zero Carbon London. So that's due to be published on the 11th of November. And I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of that research. Again, some of these things we've touched on. So as we know, London is committed to become zero carbon by 2050 or possibly as early as 2030. And so far as many as, I've now adjusted that, Kate, thank you, 30 London boroughs have declared a climate emergency. So with the built environment sector accounting for at least 40% of carbon emissions in the city, how does London's built environment sector address the net zero challenge? So our research paper examines how London is getting ready to become a zero carbon city, analysing current policies from both city and local governments, and reviewing how the private sector is addressing the challenge by setting ambitious standards and developing new industry frameworks. There's going to be a project showcase section that's going to collate the best examples of environmentally sustainable projects currently being delivered here in the capital. There's, I think, around 80 to 90 showcases and projects included in the report. So that report will really provide a snapshot of where London is in the roadmap to net zero, mapping the key stakeholders and frameworks that address the climate emergency and analysing the barriers that affect the sector in delivering effective strategies to reduce its carbon footprint. So as I say, that's a sort of a month away, and events like this will all help to inform that research. That's where we're at.
Thanks so much, Benjamin. And I'm guessing some more bedtime or even daytime reading coming up in a few weeks' time for all of us and probably all of us in the audience. Thank you for also kind of highlighting some more of the challenges, probably some of which we'll come back to, funding in particular, but also the challenge that some local authorities have around incentivization. And it's probably also linked to some of the business models, which I know we'll pick up on as well. But the policy and regulation part, I think, was also really, really interesting. And the fact that we're not always looking at the entire kind of build space from the inception through to delivery and the performance gap. So lots more topics to pick up on. And I do encourage our audience members to keep us sending us your questions if you have any. This is your chance to ask them. I think, the one question that we can't really get around at this point in time is, of course, the impact of COVID-19. And I'm not intending to talk about the health crisis as such and the way COVID has uprooted all our lives and our cities around the world. But I want to kind of pick up a little bit around the momentum it's created in the space of sustainability and climate change. And I dare say I've never heard the phrase "build back better" more than I have in the last 6 months, which is a great phrase. And it is a great time that we have, and a great moment in time we have to reflect on how we use our cities, our buildings, how we move around. But I guess my challenging question for our panel is more, we see accelerated attention. How are we actually going to mobilize that momentum? How are we going to capture on it to accelerate that transition? And what are some of the challenges that are standing in our way to do that? And I might sort of come back to Kate first on that. I know you've talked a bit about shovel-ready projects and Green New Deal, but maybe to reflect on that a little bit more.
Yeah. So the pipeline we have for the Green New Deal work is everything across all three themes. So yes, built environment, but also the others, just caveat it. I mean, the reason we have the pipeline is because we don't have the money to deliver all those projects. Some of them are fully funded. So boroughs saying that we're doing this, we want to be clear about that. But there's about £450 million gap there compared to the total pipeline. That means that boroughs are funding a lot of work already, and they are the major kind of funders in this area. But that's a big gap. And obviously, we're making the case to government and saying, we agree that we need an economic recovery. We agree it needs to be a green recovery. These are the types of projects that can make that happen in the short term. And those are all projects which can be delivered, started by the 31st of March next year. And there'll be a bigger pipeline, I think, to come forward and work we want to do with colleagues to really build that into kind of an investable pipeline. But the funding, government are not written back to us to say, oh, you need 450 million. Great, we've got that. Unfortunately, there's some of it is coming forward through the retrofitting funds. So that is a challenge. And I think that what we're looking at is, yes, we expect some of that money to come variously through funding, but mainly through finance. I think, as Benjamin said, and actually looking at green finance options and helping boroughs to understand what that means and how it is different and how the risk profile is different is something we will be working on again with the GLA and the Green Finance Institute going forward. So that's, I think, very exciting, but it will take a while to mature. I've mentioned the planning white paper, just jumping around a little bit in the regulatory space. We are concerned that it will, that boroughs will not have the same ability, or local authorities will not have the same ability to manage development proposals in line with their carbon targets and to be ambitious locally. I mean, London is already, doing much better than some other areas in terms of the ambition it's set in these areas. And if the government puts a ceiling on that, that's incredibly damaging, particularly for innovation. So we're really concerned that boroughs will lose that capacity to manage development proposals and all the competing demands that you have in a local area. And Tom will talk probably more eloquently than I to this, but that is a really important job, and it takes time and attention and knowledge of the local area. And just setting a lot of prescriptive central targets is not the way to get the best. I think we was out of the development process, and particularly when you have these challenging climate targets to meet. And the white paper also is very much about housing, very important, but not the entire development process. And there's lots of wider social and environmental factors, like greening, like sustainable urban drainage, that we absolutely need to think about to make sure that we are reducing carbon and preparing for the impacts of climate change that is already locked into the system. And I was looking at the Environment Agency's projections for Thames flooding, up to 2017. It gets really scary, and they have a plan for that, but it needs funding, and we need small scale interventions as well. I think the other thing I'd say, this is entirely different, but also been on my mind lately, is electricity infrastructure. So our entire climate strategy kind of depends on electrification, and we need the infrastructure to deliver that, and that is not in the not in the gift of the boroughs. Of course, it's not in the gift of the local authorities. We have a really important role to engage with and shape that process. But that's something we need to work with UK Power Networks and others on, and just getting that right in the right places at the right schedule will be really critical. So there's a couple of diverse challenges.
Yes, absolutely, Kate. From planning and funding through to electrification. I might sort of pick up the planning points first and ask Tom to give some reflections from a borough perspective and how this may hinder some of the projects that you've got in your pipeline.
I mean, I think it's firstly just to reiterate one of the key points that that Kate mentions there around infrastructure. I mean, you know, we will work with stakeholders to seek improvements, and we really welcome that. Obviously, the mayor's I think it was the £1.5 billion infrastructure announcement, which talked about improving electricity infrastructure, because as when we're moving forward, looking at new policies and revised policies, and seeking to transition away from energy and heat sources, which just will not get anywhere near to delivering our targets. We recognise that we will not be able to achieve those, and working collaboratively with landowners and developers, they need the infrastructure as much as we need the infrastructure. So we looking forward, we really welcome the opportunity to work with the mayor around the detail of this infrastructure funding, and I think particularly around where we can get, so we say, I guess, where the low-hanging fruit is, where we can really seek or identify where the most opportunity is, for example, in opportunity areas or similar. But I guess the challenge is especially in Southwark, is that a lot of opportunity areas are coming forward now, and actually the infrastructure that's needed is not in the pipeline. And I think actually accelerating that as part of the the Green New Deal is going to be really important, and that's just one aspect of that.
Thank you, Tom, for commenting on that. Niels, I might sort of come to you as well for, talked a bit about the challenges around the financing, the funding. What do you see as the role of private sector in perhaps helping to unlock some of these shovel-ready projects, or what do you think private sector could contribute to? You're on mute today.
Thank you. Sorry, something popped up. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think there's a role, a crucial role that the public-private sector has to play in this. I think the collaboration with the public sector is going to be absolutely essential. The private sector will need these clear and ambitious regulations to keep driving these improvements in a fair way. There's, I think, a lot in the private sector. Sorry, I keep missing that. The private sector can do in demonstrating the feasibility of some innovations. Some of the work that we're doing around experimenting on different ways of building, for example, is just to build on some of in addition to some of the points that were raised earlier, but I think addressing also not only what it takes to power these buildings, but really how we build them is crucial, and something that we as private sector really want to address. Simply acknowledging that the current way of building is really archaic, and we must be able to do better. So some of the work we're doing in Southwark, for example, shows some opportunities. We're actually also receiving Innovate UK grants on some of the work that we are doing at our project in Sermon Street, where we're demonstrating how we can build a first building as effectively as a kit of parts, being able to build quicker out of a much more rationalized, simple kit of components, in order to minimize on-site disruption, minimize emissions along the supply chain, reduce installation time, and in doing so also shaving embodied carbon, and building a project in the end that will be inherently lower carbon. But that's innovation. It's made possible because we want to drive this agenda for ourselves. Being able to in that case have the support of central government and Innovate UK funding, for example, is a great way to drive this further. Just to be able to demonstrate a case study. It's a way of building that's part of the the approach that the government wants to take to be able to deliver the building stock that we need. So if we can show that it's possible to build it first and then have the approach undertaken more widely, it's something that we definitely want to do.
Great, thanks, Niels. And I think you've picked up another two key points, I would say. One is the role of innovation, and I'm going to come to Benjamin for some thoughts on that as well in a moment. But the other one is also kind of how are we better at leveraging some of that funding and then sharing the learnings that have come from some of these projects, which we do to some extent already, but I think there's far more need for that, to not keep reinventing the wheel. And as you mentioned, construction is a great example of where there's really a need for shaking up some of the ways in which we build things. Materials is another one, looking at circular economy techniques in built environments. And we could probably add on another hour of discussions around all those themes. But Benjamin, I wanted to come to you on back to the research that you're doing and the project showcases that you are looking at. Part of that, I know you can't quite unveil all of them yet, but I was wondering if you could maybe share a few examples of some really innovative things that you've seen that others could benefit from.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to touch on a couple of things that Kate and Tom said just around the sort of energy around the recovery. And I think that the biggest issue we have is it's not necessarily around the energy, the innovation, the ambition around that. It's, as we've sort of identified, it's around the infrastructure and the finance, because what we've seen certainly through our program over the last 6 months is a huge number of ideas being put forward for ways that we can recover from COVID. Really, really exciting, innovative projects, a lot of them addressing the concerns around net zero. The issue comes with kind of the what next piece. We've got all of this amazing stuff out there. How do we make it happen? And there's lots of ideas around the polycentric model, around the 15-minute city, around pedestrianisation, all of these things. And some of them we're seeing in the short term. So if you're spending any time at all in the centre of town, you'll see a lot of pedestrianised streets, a lot of chairs and tables out in the streets. How can we kind of capitalise on that energy? That's going to be the really key thing that the GLA are going to need to consider, local government and also centralised government, in terms of how we fund those. Projects like Innovate UK, which Niels mentioned, also could play a role in the funding of things like that. In terms of some of the projects that are coming through, as you say, 80, 90 projects. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but there's a few that I just wanted to mention that do stick out, certainly on the sort of technological innovation side. So the first one is HTS, which is Hain Tillett Steel, and it's their HTS carbon counter. So they've been collaborating with KLH Sustainability and Sturgis Consulting to develop a carbon counting Revit plugin tool. This allows the practice to measure the embodied carbon of new and existing structural elements and communicate the carbon cost of design choices to clients and collaborators. So a really, really useful tool that stuck out from the showcase. An embodied carbon in MEP designed by Elementa Consulting. This is a method based on extracting data from BIM models used to create a link to an embodied carbon data set. So by extracting the right information, this method allows them to generate an accurate bill of quantities. They're then fed into an in-house embodied carbon data set, which automatically provides the embodied carbon emissions. A green toolkit, a blue-green toolkit that McGregor Coxall, the architects, have been working on for some time, tackling the issue of blue infrastructure. It's a progressive, systematic living infrastructure approach that holistically considers a development's social, environmental, economic, and governance performance. So it's a unique platform that can frame and shape the growth of sustainable communities by promoting easy and free access to waterways, multifunctional parks, nature corridors, cultural spaces, and sports facilities. And then finally, I just wanted to talk around the issue of reuse. White Recapture, which is by White Architecture. Recapture creates a digital copy of a building, which is analysed to identify materials and parts that can be reused. And this information is added directly to the BIM model. This makes a previously complex and manual process digital and transparent. So they're just a few of the initiatives that are going to be really helpful going forward on the tech side of innovation. But as I say, there's 90 more showcases and projects that we're going to be highlighting in our research next month.
Thanks, Benjamin. It's interesting that the ones that you've picked on are primarily on the use of software and data, as opposed to maybe with bricks and mortar type of solutions that people would immediately associate with built environment. I think that's really kind of poignant, because we haven't really touched much upon the role of data, but obviously for starters, you can't improve what you can't measure. as most people would say it, and that I think is a critical element to, if we don't measure what we are trying to improve, it's quite hard to make those changes. Nils, I don't know if you wanted to. Sorry, Ben.
Measure and what are those goals? So actually, if every developer, every structural engineer has a different target or different goal, how useful is that, or a different method of doing it? So I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge, is how you bring all those data sets together and utilize that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nils, I was wondering if you wanted to come into that, because obviously I'm sure Lansing does have quite some good experience around sort of frameworks, modeling and use of data to achieve those ambitions you've set out, and thought you might have some interesting reflections there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it comes back to measuring what matters is really crucial. Be it for us what it takes to build our buildings and getting a much better understanding of their actual operational impact, both of which I think the industry still has to go a long way. Benjamin has given like some great examples of what can be done, at design stage, especially to address the real, I think, elephant in the room for our industry, that is embodied carbon. So all tools, that are being developed. I think the literacy on this is growing fast, also because we're starting from really far. But I feel like it's increasingly becoming a much better understood topic, thanks to the work of organizations like Heintel and Steel and others in making this part of the advice that we receive. So being able to get a much better sorry, there's lots of sun coming in suddenly. Data come in on what it takes to build our buildings, so that we can then, on the back of that, make more informed decisions. Being able to, understand the vast difference that it makes to move away from carbon-intensive steel and cement towards different types of materials altogether, potentially looking at, inherently low-carbon materials like engineered timber, as we're doing on another project in Southwark. It only makes sense if you're able to quantify that, so that you can, because it's more complicated, it's more expensive, it makes our life, a hell lot more complicated to go through hurdles we wouldn't have to go through otherwise. But the only way that we can really reap the full benefits from that is if we're able to model that accurately. But at the moment, it's also a question of until carbon needs to be a metric, and that, to your question around funding and how to drive things forward, I think the fundamental difference that a fundamental sort of shift that would be the introduction of a carbon price, a way to track this metric across our industry, so that it's not only a matter of doing the right thing because it's the right thing, but because it would be otherwise, not financially viable to not consider it. That carbon as part of the decision-making process needs to come, I think, much more clearly in regulations, so that we can, as a sector, work around that on a level playing field, and also reallocate that capital. It's really important that would there be a carbon price, that we could, ensure this fair distribution of revenue, invest in low carbon alternatives that at the moment today, would still be coming at a price at a premium, to be able to drive these efficiencies and ensure that they can be taken on board by the masses.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Some really good points there, and the whole principle of the polluter pays. And I think the other challenge often is that, we aren't necessarily being measured on the performance of buildings. We're kind of measured on delivering them, and you've got that sort of gap thereafter. I'm mindful that we do have some questions coming in from the audience that I wanted to pick up on, and one is kind of, I think, particularly relevant to the point of retrofitting, but rather specific. So the question is, how do you align net zero carbon goals and the constraints of heritage building refurbishments, such as Westminster restoration and renewal? I don't have anybody from Westminster here, but I was wondering if, I don't know, Niels or maybe Kate has any reflections on that question, or maybe more broadly around some of the challenges of retrofit, because they're obviously not unique to historical buildings. Niels, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, it's not something that I've got direct experience of, because we don't typically own like really a historic stock in Westminster, I think. But yeah, I think first coming to first principles and being able to measure accurately the difference. In that case, being able to model the actual improvements in terms of operational energy, being able to get the right data to understand fully, where the inefficiencies lie today.
Neil, shall I have just a quick stab as well?
Sure, go for it, Tom.
Just like, I mean, the reason why, Neil, so apologies for cutting into you, is that we've just been discussing this literally yesterday, and it's about how do you maintain the significance to the heritage asset, the historic value, while delivering on the net zero goals. And one of the approach that we're taking in Southwark is a proportionate approach. I think we have to recognise that where we have heritage buildings of true value for the nation, for London and the boroughs, is that any changes to the built fabric, the performance, and as you say, closely monitored performance, ideally, needs to be proportionate to the actual physical changes to the structure. And so I think, part of us, we have to realize that we might not be able to do everything on heritage buildings. I think we have to go as far as we can, but if it does go too far, obviously we may have to just accept less, should we say, effective, say, operational reductions or similar. But we welcome innovation equally around heritage buildings where we can maintain the historic significance.
I might add something to this as well that might be relevant to Tom, but also to the person who asked the question. So some of you may know that London's one of the lead cities in the Sharing Cities programme, which is a European Horizon 2020 funded project, which is, of course, looked at piloting a number of different smart city solutions. But some of those have been around retrofit, and most specifically retrofitting of heritage buildings. So the two other main cities in this program have been Lisbon and Milan. One of the key retrofit projects they've done is actually the City Hall in Lisbon, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I think they've improved energy efficiency by something like 30%, if I'm not mistaken. Most interestingly, the Sharing Cities program is currently in its final phase, which is all focused on disseminating that knowledge, packaging it up, and kind of raising the impact of the initial funding that's gone into it. And what that means is there's a number of playbooks that share in quite great detail the work that has gone on, what the learnings that have happened, stumbling blocks along the way, and challenges. So I think that'd be a particularly relevant one in this particular case to look at. If you haven't already found it, just go to the Sharing Cities website, or if not, feel free to drop me a line. I'm sure the team at the GLA would be very happy to share those findings. So I'm mindful we are coming up near the end of our conversation. I'm just going to encourage the audience much more. If there are any other questions that you would like our panel to answer, please do avail yourself of the opportunity. If not, I'm going to kind of go around all our panelists for sort of one final kind of comment in the sense of where would you like to see us in 12 months' time? What's the one thing you would like us to have see addressed? No pressure. You might not have the solution, but what does good look like? And Benjamin, why don't I start off with you?
Sure. For me, I think it's sort of going back to the issue of it will be hopefully in much further along the recovery period, and we'll be maybe back in the office, hopefully. But it will be around finding ways to create a more sustainable long-term approach to the public realm, and actually that impact on our ability to reach net zero targets in terms of getting people out of their cars, getting people onto the streets. So that's walking and cycling. It's a very popular one. It's something that everybody in our audience understands. I think there's a lot of people that can get behind it. We've seen that from how quickly some of these ideas have been put into the street now. But coming up with feasible, sustainable methods of making those changes long term, I think is going to be really, really critical. And then the point that I wanted to just make, which we haven't quite covered was something that we talk a lot about at NLA, which is this long life, loose fit model, in that we are ensuring that we're not building buildings that won't be fit for purpose in 20 years' time. We need to make sure that we're not ripping down buildings and putting new ones up, and that where we can, we're utilizing that methodology around the circular economy, where we're reusing, we're retrofitting, we're revitalizing our buildings. And I think that's a really key thing to just keep in mind as we go through the recovery.
Wonderful. Thank you, Benjamin. Tom, you're on mute, though.
A good question to ask there, Lucette. I guess I'm going to go for something quite maybe a little more hidden compared to what Ben said, and I'm going to be I'd like to actually propose that we have more methods to tackle the implementation gap between buildings that are consented and constructed, and then actually the difference between their actual operational performance. So we're looking at ways at potential policy drivers to secure, or to at least highlight the issue around the implementation gap. And I think what we'd welcome as part of that is collaboration with the private sector, with landowners, developers, architects, to seek ways of how we could overcome that issue.
Thank you, Tom. Niels?
I think I'd probably be looking at consistency in net zero claims across the board. We hear an awful lot of net zero being talked about, but at the moment there's still there's an enormous progress that's been made in laying the groundworks for frameworks around what that means in definitions, but we're still seeing vast definitions between what a net zero home means for the GLA compared to what it means to the Committee on Climate Change, for example, what it means from one borough to the next. At corporate level, I think the Better Building Partnership is doing amazing work in asking corporates to really lay out what they intend to include in their plans and their claims. But in a year's time, I hope that we'll have a much better collective understanding of what's behind each of these claims. The same for, say, offsetting principles, for example. We haven't really talked about this, but what goes behind credible claims that everybody understands, clear scopes, and I think it'll do a lot of good.
Absolutely. I do see another audience question has come in, and I'm going to ask it to you because you talked about timber earlier. So the question is, how do you actually intend to meet the stretch targets for embodied carbon if the specification of structural timber and timber cladding is going to be outlawed by the insurance industry in post-Grenfell regulation? Which is a very poignant question, but you had, of course, mentioned earlier, you referenced the use of timber.
I'll try to be really brief. I'm conscious that Kate hasn't...
and everyone comes to Kate.
I think it's tragic, to be honest. It's really making going backwards. Timber is the best shot we have at a low carbon construction material. That specifically, for the housing sector, the domestic sector, is going to make our life very, very difficult. Low carbon steel, cement, being able to find innovations there, but it's not going to be easy at all. We talked on retrofit, being able to build on what's existing as much as possible and avoid that. For the question around the 0 to 35 kilowatt square meter, so that's operational energy, building on existing frameworks that have proven track records like Passive House, being able to track performance through design and mandate operational performance throughout construction and delivery, I think would be a good way to start.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps it's one of those topics that will need not just cross-industry, but maybe cross multiple industries conversation. But Kate, I do want to come to you for your view on where you'd like to be in 12 months.
Yeah, the longer this goes on, the more things I think.
you can have one.
Okay, so a year from now, we will be a month before the COP26 being held in Glasgow. So this will be, I really, really hope that government take this opportunity of having, being on the global stage to have set out a plan across, yes, the built environment, but also every other area we mentioned and all the ones they need to address, that credibly gets us to 2050, to their target. And that's not even to speak about our own 2030 targets, but really a policy and regulatory framework with backed up funding that can, secure the benefits of that. And in particular, secure long-term funding for retrofit that can enable us to plan, but can enable businesses to invest and to develop the skills to bring back to the beginning that we need for the Green New Deal.
Thank you, Kate. I think that's concluded us on a great note, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize every sort of fantastic items of where we want to be in 12 months' time. Fortunately, we definitely come up for time, and so we'll have to wrap up here. I want to thank all of our speakers for their great insights and contributions. I also want to thank White Label and all the organisations who supported and sponsored this week's activities at Real Estate Live UK, with of course many more to follow. And of course, a thank you to the great audience for joining us today and throwing some challenging questions at us. I'm going to hand back over to Catherine from White Label, who has a few announcements to make.
Great, thanks for that, Lisa. And just to reiterate my thanks to all of you for taking part, and for those of you that are watching and asking all those questions today. Now, that does conclude today's Real Estate Live sessions, but we have a really packed day tomorrow. We have 8 sessions in total happening across the course of tomorrow. And we start off at 9 AM tomorrow by heading north, where we're going up to Scotland. We're going to have a keynote speech from the Minister, Ivan McKee. He's Scotland's Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation, and he'll be kicking us off at 9 AM tomorrow. And straight after that at 9:30, we'll then be in a keynote session about Glasgow and how innovation sectors can drive growth in these unprecedented times, and then much more to follow. I just want to finish by sharing with you the results of the poll, and you'll be glad to know, given that we've been talking about carbon zero, that 65% of you thought that was the most important thing in these times to be concentrating on, closely followed by 45% of you thinking that social infrastructure and a skilled workforce were important. So that concludes, as I say, the session for today. Thank you to everybody for taking part and for watching, and we look forward to catching up with many more of you in the coming days. Thanks very much and goodbye.